Night settled gently over the city, and the sky wore its familiar silence. There was no wind. The only sound came from a distant train, its metallic hum drifting through the dark. People dimmed their lights, easing themselves out of the day. The calendar showed the final days of 2024, and no one yet knew this year would be remembered differently from the others. Daphne stood by the window. She rested her fingers against the cold glass. She had loved watching the sky since childhood, but in recent months the habit had taken on a different meaning. The sky no longer felt empty. It felt like it was holding something, quiet, patient, waiting. That night, everything looked normal. The stars were steady, the moon hung thin and pale. She checked her phone. 10:41 p.m. Her eyes returned to the horizon. That was when a brief glow appeared low in the sky. It wasn't a shooting star. It wasn't an airplane light. It was softer, controlled. Daphne held her breath. The light vanished. Then it returned. Same position. No movement. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice fading into the room. The street below was silent. No cars, no voices. It felt as if she were the only one witnessing the moment. The light remained suspended, then slowly began to rise. It didn't accelerate. It didn't flicker. It moved as if it had made a decision. She reached for her phone, but hesitated. She didn't want to break the moment. Watching felt more important than recording. The light split into two. Then it merged again. And then, as if it had never existed, it was gone. The room felt darker afterward. Daphne closed the window. Her heart was racing, but not with fear, with curiosity. She sat on the edge of the bed and stayed there, still, for a long time. Morning came like any other. The news showed ordinary headlines, weather updates, markets, traffic. Not a word about the sky. Daphne went to work, attended meetings, answered questions. But the light stayed with her quietly in the back of her mind. During lunch, messages began to arrive. One, then another, all asking the same thing. "Did you see something in the sky last night?" They came from different people, neighbors. Someone described the light as greenish. Another claimed it appeared over the water. Daphne stared at the screen. She wasn't alone. That evening, local forums came alive. Short posts, blurry photos, shaking videos. No one could explain what they had seen, but everyone agreed on one thing. Something had happened. Officials said nothing. No alerts. No statements. The silence only fed the speculation. People filled the gap themselves. Some called it a new drone technology. Others blamed atmospheric effects. Daphne returned to the window that night. The sky was empty, but it didn't feel the same. It was as if a curtain had been lifted and quietly lowered again. At the same hour, in other cities and other countries, people were looking up. Coastal towns, mountain villages, sprawling cities. Some saw lights. Some felt something without seeing anything at all. They described the sky as closer, more present. A week later, the first reports appeared, carefully worded, cautious. Unidentified aerial events. No threat mentioned, no explanation offered, just observations, dates, times, coordinates. Daphne read them again and again. In some lines, she recognized her own experience. The same hour, the same direction, the same silence. As the year moved on, The events increased, but they never arrived with drama. No landings, no announcements, just small repeating moments. Lights, movements, sudden stops where motion should have continued. People began to adjust. The sky became something you checked, like the weather. Children pointed upward. Adults paused mid step. Conversations drifted toward questions no one expected to be asking again. Not what is it, but is it happening tonight? Daphne started keeping notes, times, colors, shapes, how long the light stayed. She didn't know why. It felt important. One night, months later, she stood by the same window, the same hour. The city below was quieter now. Fewer cars, softer lights. A glow appeared again. This time it stayed longer. The following weeks passed with a strange calm. Life continued, but something subtle had shifted. People still went to work, still complained about traffic and deadlines, but their eyes drifted upward more often now. The sky had become part of daily awareness, like a quiet thought you couldn't fully push away. Daphne noticed it everywhere. In cafes, conversations would pause when someone mentioned a light they had seen. On buses, passengers leaned toward the windows at night, staring a second longer than necessary. No one laughed it off anymore. Not completely. She kept writing in her notebook. Simple entries. Date, time, direction. Sometimes there was nothing to record, and yet she wrote anyway. Those nights felt just as important. Silence, too, had a pattern. One evening, after a long day, she met her brother Emery for tea. They sat near the window of a small, quiet place. The television above the counter played with the sound muted. News tickers crawled along the bottom of the screen. "You're still watching the sky," Emery said, stirring his tea. "So are you," Daphne replied. He smiled faintly. "I guess I am." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the streetlights glowed softly. No unusual movement, just the ordinary rhythm of the city. "I saw something again," Emery said finally. "3 nights ago, over the hills." Daphne looked at him, alert. "What kind of something?" "Not a shape," he said. "More like a presence. A light that felt like it was looking back." The words lingered between them. Daphne understood what he meant, even though it sounded impossible. She had felt it too. Not eyes exactly. Attention. Reports from around the world followed the same tone. No panic, no urgency, just careful documentation. Scientists spoke in cautious language. Pilots submitted logs. Astronomers compared notes. Still, there was no single explanation. At night, Daphne began to dream differently. She dreamed of wide, open skies with no ground beneath her, of drifting slowly, peacefully, with no sense of falling. She would wake before dawn, heart steady, mind clear. One morning she noticed a message request on her phone. It was from a woman named Lena. She lived in another country, thousands of kilometers away. "I think we're seeing the same thing," the message said. They began to talk, slowly at first, comparing times, colors, feelings. Their experiences didn't match perfectly, but they aligned in ways that felt too precise to be coincidence. Soon, the conversation grew. Lena added others. A small group formed, different ages, different backgrounds, all watching the same sky. They didn't call themselves anything. No name felt right. They simply shared observations, no theories, no conclusions. One night, While reading through the group's messages, Daphne felt a sudden stillness. The room seemed quieter than usual. Even the hum of the refrigerator faded into the background. She stood and went to the window. The sky was clear, dark, calm. Then directly above the city, a light appeared. Not distant this time, not near the horizon. It was higher, brighter. It didn't move. Daphne's breath slowed. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. "I see it," someone wrote. "Same here. Above us, too." The light pulsed gently, like a slow heartbeat. It didn't blind or dazzle. It simply existed, steady and deliberate. For the first time, Daphne raised her phone and started recording. The light responded. It shifted slightly, not away, not closer, just enough to acknowledge the change. The realization sent a chill through her arms. "It knows," she whispered. The light remained for nearly a full minute. Then it dimmed and vanished, leaving the sky untouched. Within hours the footage spread, clearer than anything before. Multiple angles, multiple cities, too many witnesses to ignore. By morning, officials released a statement. Short, neutral. "These events are under investigation." No denial this time. The world didn't panic. It leaned forward. News channels ran endless loops of the videos. Experts debated possibilities. Language softened. Certainty disappeared. Children asked questions their parents couldn't answer. Daphne felt something unexpected. Relief. The unknown was no longer private. It was shared. That night, she returned to the window once more. The sky was empty again, but it no longer felt distant. For the first time, she had the clear sense that whatever was out there was not rushing. It was observing, and it was waiting. After the statement was released, the world changed without announcing itself. There were no sirens, no emergency broadcasts, no sudden rules. Yet something fundamental had moved, like a compass needle slowly turning. People stopped asking if the lights were real. The question became when they would appear again. Daphne felt it first in the smallest places. At the bakery near her apartment, the owner had placed a chair outside, angled toward the sky. In the evenings, customers lingered longer, their purchases forgotten in their hands. Silence between strangers felt less awkward now. Everyone was listening for the same thing. At work, meetings shortened, not because productivity improved, but because focus drifted. Someone would pause mid-sentence, glance toward the window, then continue as if nothing had happened. No one commented on it. The nights were different too, louder in a quiet way, less sleep, more watching. Daphne's notebook grew thicker. She added a new column without thinking much about it. Response. Most nights the column stayed empty. Then, one evening, it didn't. She had returned home late. The city lights shimmered below her window, steady and familiar. She didn't expect to see anything. She rarely did when she expected it. The light appeared almost gently, like a thought entering the mind rather than a thing entering the sky. It hovered high above, faint but distinct. Daphne didn't move. She felt a strange calm settle over her. No rush, no fear, just awareness. She whispered, without planning to, "I see you." The light pulsed once. Daphne's hand trembled slightly as she wrote in her notebook. Response. Yes. She closed the book and sat down, her back against the wall. Her heart beat slowly, evenly. This wasn't contact, she told herself. It wasn't communication. It was coincidence layered over meaning. Still, the feeling stayed with her long after the light faded. The group chat exploded that night. Messages came faster than she could read them. Did anyone feel that? It reacted. I didn't record. I didn't want to. Same. Patterns began to form, not in movement or shape, but in timing. The lights appeared when watched. Not always, but often enough to matter. As if attention itself was part of the exchange. Scientists began to notice it too. New studies emerged, carefully worded, exploring observer effect beyond physics. Sociologists joined the discussion. Psychologists followed. No one used dramatic language. No one said the word contact. But no one dismissed the idea anymore either. Daphne took time off work. She didn't explain why, and no one asked. She spent her days reading reports, watching the sky from different locations, hills outside the city, quiet beaches, rooftops. In open spaces, the lights felt closer, not physically, but emotionally, if that made sense. The sky seemed deeper there, less cluttered. One afternoon, Lena called her for the first time. Hearing her voice made the connection feel suddenly real. They're not random, Lena said softly. They're careful. Daphne smiled faintly. That's exactly the word I've been using. Careful. The lights never appeared during storms, never during disasters, never when fear dominated the air. They favored calm nights, clear skies, stillness. It felt intentional. Weeks passed. Governments shifted their tone again. Committees were formed. International cooperation increased quietly, efficiently. Old rivalries softened, if only a little. The sky had become a shared concern, a shared mystery. One night, Daphne joined a small gathering on a hill overlooking the city. No cameras, no drones, just people sitting in silence, looking up. They didn't speak much. Words felt unnecessary. When the light appeared, it wasn't alone. Three glows emerged, evenly spaced, forming a slow arc across the sky. They didn't move toward one another. They simply held position. No one reached for their phones. Daphne felt tears sting her eyes, surprising her, not from fear, from recognition, a sense that something important was happening, even if she couldn't name it. The lights stayed longer than usual, nearly 5 minutes. In that time, no one panicked and no one shouted. A few people quietly laughed, the way you do when something overwhelms you in a good way. Then, just as calmly, the lights faded. The group sat there long after, reluctant to break the moment. On her way home, Daphne realized something had changed inside her. The question she carried was no longer, what are they? It was, why now? That night she dreamed again of the open sky, but this time she wasn't alone. Shapes moved beside her, distant and indistinct, keeping pace without touching. She woke with a single thought lingering in her mind, clear and steady. This wasn't an arrival. It was an introduction. The days after the gathering on the hill carried a softer weight. Nothing dramatic followed. No announcements, no sudden appearances. Yet the absence itself felt deliberate, as if the sky had said enough for now. Daphne moved through her routines with heightened awareness. Sounds felt clearer. Light seemed sharper. Even silence had texture. She noticed how often people paused mid-conversation, searching the sky without realizing they were doing it. The world had slowed, not in action, but in attention. Researchers released new findings, carefully framed. Correlations between sightings and environmental calm, reduced electromagnetic noise, lower atmospheric disturbance. The lights appeared where the world was quiet enough to notice them, not where people were loud. Daphne underlined that sentence twice in her notes. One evening, Lena sent a short message. Try not watching. Daphne read it twice. That night she resisted the urge to stand by the window. She turned off the lights, sat on the floor, and closed her eyes. No phone, no notebook, just stillness. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Then, without opening her eyes, she felt it. Not a sound, not a vibration. A presence, gentle and steady, like standing near someone who wasn't touching you, but was undeniably there. Her breath deepened. A warmth spread through her chest, subtle but real. It wasn't emotional. It was physical, like standing in sunlight after a long winter. When she opened her eyes, the room was unchanged. But through the glass, high above the city, a single light hovered. She hadn't been watching. The realization sent a quiet shiver through her. The light pulsed once, slow, even. Daphne didn't move. She didn't wave or speak. She simply acknowledged it, the way you acknowledge another person in a shared space. The light dimmed slightly, then held steady. Response without performance, she wrote later. Across the world, similar experiments were unfolding. Small groups, quiet rooms, open fields, no cameras, no live streams. The results were inconsistent, but the pattern was undeniable. The lights appeared more often when attention was relaxed, as if urgency disrupted something fragile. Governments adjusted again. Observation protocols shifted. Less pursuit, more patience. The language of control softened into the language of listening. Daphne was invited to join a private forum moderated by researchers, artists, and linguists. No speculation was allowed, only descriptions. What did it feel like? What changed afterward? What stayed the same? The answers varied, but a shared tone emerged. Calm, clarity, connection without closeness. One night, while reviewing entries, Daphne noticed a timestamp pattern she hadn't seen before. Certain appearances aligned with others, not by location, but by moment. Same minute, same second, across continents. She sent the observation to the group. The response was immediate. That's not movement, someone wrote. That's synchronization. The word settled heavily in her mind. Synchronization implied intention without travel, presence without distance. The sky, it seemed, was not coming closer. Understanding was. Later that week, Daphne returned to the hill alone. The city below pulsed softly with light. She sat on the grass and waited, not for anything specific, just open. Minutes stretched. Then the sky responded. This time, the light did not hover above. It appeared to the side, low and distant, as if choosing not to dominate the view. Daphne smiled without meaning to. I see you, she said quietly. The light brightened just a little. For the first time, she felt certain of something she couldn't prove. Whatever was watching did not want awe. It wanted recognition. When the light faded, Daphne stayed seated, her thoughts steady. This was no longer about discovery. It was about relationship. By the time the fifth month passed without incident, people had learned a new kind of patience, not the restless kind that waits for something to happen, but a softer patience that accepts not knowing as part of the experience. Daphne felt it in herself. The urge to document everything had faded. Her notebook stayed closed more often now. When she did write, the entries were shorter, less detail, more feeling. The sky had stopped being a puzzle to solve. It had become a presence to live alongside. Public spaces subtly adapted. Rooftops were opened. Parks stayed lit later at night, not brighter but gentler. Cities adjusted their noise patterns without ever officially admitting why. Fewer flashing signs, quieter drones, softer nights. People didn't demand these changes. They emerged naturally, like habits forming around something fragile. In schools, children began drawing the sky differently. Teachers noticed it first. Fewer suns in the corners of pages, more open space, more dots, arcs, and soft glows suspended above simple landscapes. When asked what they were drawing, the children didn't say aliens. They said, the watches, or the quiet lights. The word spread without explanation. Daphne watched one evening from a crowded rooftop downtown. Dozens of people stood side by side, strangers sharing thermoses, blankets, and silence. No one spoke above a whisper. Phones stayed mostly in pockets. When the light appeared, it did not command attention. It blended into the sky, subtle enough that some people didn't notice right away. A man near Daphne gasped softly. There, he said, pointing, careful not to move too fast. The light held its place, faint and steady. No one cheered. No one clapped. No one recorded. They simply stood together. Daphne felt a warmth spread through her again. Not intense, not overwhelming. Familiar now, comforting, as if the sky recognized the effort being made. Across the world, similar scenes unfolded, not organized, not coordinated. Just people gathering where they could see clearly and wait calmly. The news struggled to frame it. There was no crisis, no countdown, no conflict, just a global shift in behavior that didn't fit old narratives. Analysts called it a cultural response. Philosophers called it humility. Some refused to call it anything at all. One afternoon, Lena sent a voice message instead of text. They're not above us, she said quietly. They're with us. Just not here. Daphne replayed the message several times. That night, she dreamed of standing at the edge of something vast. Not a cliff, not space. A horizon that curved gently upward, endless but welcoming. Lights moved along it like distant ships, never approaching, never leaving. When she woke, the feeling stayed. The following week, something new happened. The lights appeared during the day, not bright enough to challenge the sun, just visible if you knew where to look. Pale shapes, like reflections that didn't belong to anything. People noticed, slowly, carefully. No alarms were raised. Instead, umbrellas tilted, sunglasses lifted, faces turned upward in quiet acknowledgement. Daphne stood in the street, surrounded by strangers who had all paused at the same moment. No one spoke, but a shared understanding passed between them. This was deliberate. Later, official channels released another statement, longer this time, still cautious. These phenomena show no hostile behavior, no evidence of threat. Observation continues. The word threat lingered on screens, then faded. That evening, Daphne returned home and opened her notebook for the first time in days. She wrote one sentence: "We are not being approached. We are being invited." She closed the book. Outside, the sky darkened gently, and somewhere within it, unseen but present, something watched with equal patience. The idea of invitation settled into the world slowly, like a new word learning its place in a language. People didn't speak it aloud often, but it shaped how they moved, how they waited, how they listened. Daphne noticed the change most clearly in herself. She no longer felt like a witness. She felt like a participant, though she wasn't sure what that participation required. One evening, the private forum released a simple prompt. If you were to respond, what would you say? No suggestions followed, no frameworks, just the question. Daphne stared at the screen for a long time. Words felt inadequate, too sharp, too human. She closed the laptop and stepped outside instead. The air was cool. The city hummed quietly below its usual volume. She walked until she reached a small park, nearly empty at that hour. She sat on a bench and looked up. The sky was clear. She didn't speak. She didn't gesture. She simply allowed herself to be present without expectation. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, the familiar warmth returned. Subtle, centered. A light appeared directly overhead, faint but unmistakable. Daphne exhaled slowly. "I don't know what to say," she said, her voice barely above her breath. The light pulsed once. She felt no pressure to continue. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt complete. Around the world, others were having similar moments, not synchronized by time or place, but by approach. Quiet acknowledgement. Honest uncertainty. Linguists proposed that language might not be the point. Biologists suggested shared states mattered more than symbols. Neuroscientists began mapping calm responses rather than fear reactions. The lights continued to appear, responding not to signals, but to states of mind. That was when the first reply came. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't an image. It was a feeling that arrived whole, without sequence. A sense of being understood without being examined. Daphne felt it settle gently, like a thought that wasn't hers but didn't feel foreign. "We see you seeing us." Tears filled her eyes, surprising her again. Not from awe, from relief. She didn't try to hold on to the feeling. She let it pass, trusting it would leave what it needed behind. Later, when she described the experience in the forum, others responded with strikingly similar words. Not identical. Aligned. Scientists hesitated to call it communication, but they stopped denying it. The world adjusted again. There were no declarations of first contact, no celebrations, no fear-driven reactions, just a quiet recalibration of what connection meant. Daphne slept deeply that night. No dreams, no visions, just rest. In the morning the sky was empty, blue, ordinary. And yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. For the first time, humanity had not shouted into the dark. It had listened, and something had listened back. After the first reply, the world did not rush forward. If anything, it slowed even more. There was an unspoken understanding that speed might be the one thing that could break whatever balance had formed. Daphne felt it in the mornings. She woke without urgency. The day no longer felt like something to conquer. It felt like something to move through carefully. Public conversations changed tone. News anchors spoke more softly. Debates lost their sharp edges. Even disagreement carried less heat. People were listening more than they were insisting. It wasn't unity, it was restraint. The lights appeared less often now, but when they did, they stayed longer. Their presence felt steady, unhurried, as if they were matching a rhythm humanity was only beginning to learn. Researchers coined a quiet phrase for it: pacing. Not escalation, not retreat. A shared tempo. Daphne joined a small study group that met in person once a week. No devices were allowed in the room, just notes taken by hand after the meetings ended. They sat in a circle and spoke about sensations rather than sightings. What did it feel like when the lights appeared? What changed inside you afterward? What stayed with you days later? The answers were personal, but a pattern emerged. People felt less alone, less defensive, more willing to pause before reacting. One man admitted he had stopped replaying old arguments in his head. A woman said her chronic anxiety had softened, not vanished, but loosened its grip. No one claimed miracles, just shifts. One night, Daphne walked home later than usual. The streets were nearly empty. She didn't look up right away. She let her steps set the rhythm. Halfway down the block, she felt it. Not warmth this time, alignment. She stopped. The light was there, off to her left, hovering above the rooftops. It did not brighten when she noticed it. It did not pulse. It waited. Daphne understood suddenly that waiting was the point. She didn't speak. She didn't acknowledge it outwardly. She simply stood, breathing, allowing the moment to exist without trying to define it. The light remained for nearly 10 minutes. When it finally faded, Daphne felt no loss, no longing, just completion. At home, she opened her notebook and wrote a single line: "They are teaching us how to stay." Across the world, similar realizations were forming. Humanity had always measured progress by movement, expansion, speed, reach. The light suggested something else: depth, presence, attention. There were no new statements from officials that week. No updates were needed. The absence of noise felt like respect. Daphne lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. She didn't wonder what would happen next. She trusted that whatever came would arrive at the right pace. And for the first time in her life, that felt like enough. Trust did not arrive all at once. It formed quietly, like a shoreline shaped by tides rather than waves. No agreement was signed, no promise was spoken aloud. Yet something mutual was taking shape in the space between watching and being watched. Daphne noticed how fear had slowly loosened its grip on public imagination. Online forums that once spiraled into speculation now settled into reflection. People asked better questions, not louder ones. What do we offer by how we live? What do we show without trying? The lights appeared one evening while Daphne was with the study group. They were seated in silence, eyes closed, breathing evenly. No one had planned to observe. That mattered. A gentle brightness filtered through the room. No one opened their eyes right away. They felt it together. A shared awareness, soft but unmistakable. When they finally looked, the light hovered outside the window, perfectly still. It did not react to their attention. It accepted it. Afterward, no one rushed to speak. They sat for a long time, absorbing the quiet weight of what had happened. When words finally came, they were careful. It didn't feel like being examined, someone said. It felt like being trusted, another replied. Daphne nodded. That was the word. Trust. Across the world, similar moments were reported. The lights began to appear in response to collective calm rather than individual focus. Parks, libraries, hospitals at night, places where people gathered without urgency. They avoided crowds driven by excitement. They avoided fear. They chose stillness. Children sensed it first. They stopped pointing and started waving, not with excitement, but with familiarity. Parents noticed and followed their lead. Daphne watched a child in the park lift her hand toward the sky and then lower it, satisfied, as if greeting a neighbor who had already seen her. No one corrected her. The scientific community shifted its internal language. Papers spoke less about phenomena and more about interaction environments. Observation was no longer one-sided. Late one night, alone in her apartment, Daphne felt the now familiar alignment settle in. She didn't move to the window. She stayed where she was. The light appeared anyway, reflected softly against the walls. For the first time, she spoke without hesitation. "You can take your time," she said. The light pulsed twice, slow, even, not acknowledgement, agreement. Daphne felt a smile form, quiet and genuine. Whatever this was, it was not impatient. It was not demanding answers or offering them. It was building something fragile. And fragile things, she understood now, required care from both sides. When the light faded, the room returned to normal. But the feeling stayed, warm and steady. Trust, once shaped, did not vanish. It remained. Language began to feel heavier than before. Not wrong, just limited. People still spoke, still wrote, still explained, but fewer believed that meaning lived entirely in sentences. Daphne noticed it during interviews she declined. Researchers wanted statements, clear descriptions, quotable lines. She understood their need, but something inside her resisted being flattened into language. Some experiences lost their shape when spoken. The lights continued to appear, but their behavior shifted again. They no longer responded to acknowledgement or calm alone. They appeared most often during moments when people were not thinking about them at all. Laughter, grief, shared quietly, focus deep enough to forget the self. Daphne saw one while washing dishes, hands in warm water, mind empty. It reflected faintly in the glass, so subtle she almost missed it. She didn't stop what she was doing. The light stayed. Later, she wrote in her notebook, "Presence does not require attention, only honesty." Around the world, the same realization emerged in fragments. Meditators stopped trying to summon, scientists stopped provoking variables, children stopped asking questions and started drawing again. The sky had become a companion, not a spectacle. One afternoon, Daphne sat with Emery in silence, watching the horizon. They hadn't spoken in nearly an hour. It didn't feel awkward. "You know," Emery said finally, "I don't feel like we're being watched anymore." Daphne nodded. Neither do I. They both understood what that meant. Watching implied distance. This felt like sharing space. That night, Daphne dreamed without images, just sensation, a sense of expansion that didn't erase boundaries, only softened them. When she woke, her chest felt light, unburdened. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. The lights stopped appearing. Not abruptly, not everywhere at once. They simply became less frequent, then rare, then absent. Panic did not follow. Instead, there was a quiet pause, like the space after a deep breath. People waited and waited. Nothing. Daphne felt no loss, no fear, just a gentle understanding forming at the edges of thought. Whatever had been needed had been given. One evening, weeks later, she sat by the window out of habit. The sky was dark, ordinary, empty. She smiled. "We're still here," she said softly, not to the sky, but to the moment. There was no reply. And that was okay. When nothing followed the silence, the world learned how to carry it. Days passed, then weeks. The sky stayed empty. No lights, no signals, no sense of being observed. And still, something had changed. Daphne noticed it in the way people moved through space. Crowded places felt less tense. Strangers made room for one another without thinking. Arguments ended sooner, not because they were resolved, but because they no longer felt necessary. The absence of the lights was not a return to before. It was an after. At work, projects slowed, deadlines stretched, quality replaced urgency in quiet ways. No one announced this shift, it simply happened, like a collective exhale that never fully reversed. Daphne stopped keeping notes altogether. The notebook sat untouched on her shelf, its pages full but no longer needed. She trusted what had been learned to stay where it belonged. One afternoon, she visited the hill again. The grass was taller now. The city below looked the same as ever, but felt less insistent. She sat where she had before, alone, watching nothing. Memories surfaced easily, not of the lights themselves, but of the way time had felt when they were present. Spacious, gentle. She realized then that the lights had never asked for attention. They had asked for change. Across the world, similar understandings took hold. Environmental policies softened into long-term thinking. Conflicts cooled, not ended, but held with more care. People paused more often before reacting. No one credited the sky. There was no proof to point to, no evidence to argue over, just outcomes. One night, months later, Daphne woke suddenly. No warmth, no alignment, just a sense of clarity. She stood by the window, more out of habit than hope. The sky was dark and still. She didn't wait. She turned back into the room, confident. Somewhere far beyond sight, something had moved on. Not because it was finished, because it trusted what had been left behind. Daphne lay back down and slept, deeply and without dreams. In the morning, the world continued, and it continued differently. Time moved forward without ceremony. Seasons changed. News cycles shifted. New concerns rose and fell as they always had. Yet beneath the surface, something subtle endured, passed quietly from moment to moment. Daphne felt it most clearly in ordinary choices. She noticed when she paused before replying to a sharp comment, when she listened without preparing a response, when silence felt like an option rather than a gap to be filled. Others carried it too, even if they never named it. In cafes, people sat longer with their cups untouched. In trains, fewer headphones went on. In classrooms, teachers allowed questions to linger without immediate answers, not because they lacked knowledge, but because uncertainty had lost its threat. The inheritance was not information, it was a way of being. Daphne met Lena in person for the first time that spring. They chose a quiet coastal town, neutral ground between their lives. The sea was calm, stretching wide and reflective beneath a pale sky. They walked without rushing. When they spoke, it was slowly. "Do you miss it?" Lena asked eventually. Daphne considered the question. "No," she said, "but I'm grateful it happened." Lena smiled. "That feels right." They stood together, watching the horizon. No lights appeared. Neither of them expected any. The sky had given what it came to give. In the months that followed, art began to change. Music grew simpler, fewer crescendos, longer rests. Painters left more space on their canvases. Writers trusted the reader to sit with ambiguity. Critics called it a phase. It wasn't. Daphne noticed children adapting fastest. They grew comfortable with pauses, with not being entertained every second, with looking out windows and seeing value in nothing happening. One afternoon, a child in the park asked her a question. "Do you think they'll come back?" Daphne crouched to the child's level. She didn't rush her answer. "I think," she said gently, "that if they ever do, we won't need to look for them." The child nodded, satisfied, and ran back to play. That night, Daphne dreamed of hands passing something invisible from one to another. No urgency, no instruction, just care. When she woke, the feeling lingered. The inheritance was quiet, and it was everywhere. Time began to feel less like a line and more like a field. Moments no longer rushed toward the next one with the same insistence. Days held their shape. Even busy weeks carried pockets of stillness. Daphne sensed it when she stopped checking the hour. Meals stretched. Walks took longer without covering more distance. Waiting no longer felt like being delayed. Clocks still worked. Schedules still existed, but they no longer ruled attention. Researchers noticed it in unexpected data. Stress markers declined in small but consistent ways. Decision-making slowed, then improved. Fewer errors, fewer impulsive reactions. No single cause could be identified. Only a shift in pace. Daphne volunteered at a local library once a week. The quiet there felt different now, thicker, like it had weight. People came not just to read, but to sit, to be held by the calm. One afternoon, an elderly man closed his book and said, almost to himself, "It feels like time is listening." Daphne smiled. She understood what he meant. At night, the sky remained empty, yet it felt nearer than before, as if distance had lost relevance. Stars seemed less decorative, more present, not watching, sharing. A new kind of ritual emerged without instruction. People paused at dusk, not to look up, not to expect anything, just to mark the transition, a breath between day and night. Daphne joined it naturally. Standing by her window as light faded, she placed her hand against the glass, grounding herself in the moment. No lights appeared. What came instead was a steady clarity, the sense that nothing was missing. Months passed. Stories of the lights softened into memory, then into reference. Younger people heard about them the way one hears about a rare storm or an eclipse. Something that happened, something that mattered, but not something to recreate. Daphne met Emery again, sitting on a bench by the river. The water moved slowly, reflecting the sky in broken patterns. "Do you ever think about how fast everything used to feel?" he asked. She nodded. "I think we were afraid of stopping. And now stopping feels like moving," she said. They watched the river without speaking. Later that night, Daphne wrote for the first time in months. Just a few words, careful and unadorned. Time didn't change. We did. She closed the notebook and placed it back on the shelf. Outside, the sky darkened fully, calm and ordinary. And that was enough. As memory settled into history, one question remained strangely absent. No one asked it aloud, and because it was never spoken, it lingered everywhere. Why us? Daphne felt it sometimes, not as curiosity, but as a quiet pressure behind her thoughts. Humanity had long imagined contact as a test to be passed or a challenge to overcome. What had happened instead felt more like recognition. But recognition of what? The absence of answers no longer felt like avoidance, it felt intentional. Whatever had unfolded had not been about explanation. It had been about preparation. Daphne saw this most clearly in moments of conflict. Arguments still happened. Pain still existed. But there was more space between reaction and response. A pause where something else could enter. Choice. In universities, new courses emerged, not labeled as alien studies or contact theory, but under titles like relational awareness and non-directive communication. Students learned to listen without steering, to observe without needing control. The skills felt oddly familiar. Daphne attended one such lecture out of curiosity. The professor spoke slowly, leaving room between ideas. "We keep asking what they wanted," he said. "But perhaps the more important question is what we learned we could give. Attention, patience, care without demand. None of it required another presence to exist." One evening, walking home, Daphne passed a small protest. A few people held signs demanding answers, demanding proof, demanding return. They were calm, not angry, but insistent. Daphne paused at a distance. She felt no judgment toward them. Wanting certainty was human. She simply didn't share the need anymore. That night she dreamed again, not of lights, but of thresholds, doorways without doors, openings that required nothing but the willingness to step through. When she woke, the feeling followed her into the day. The unasked question did not need answering, because it was slowly becoming irrelevant. What mattered now was not why the sky had changed. It was whether humanity could live with what it had been shown, and whether it would choose to. Listening became a discipline without being named as one. It wasn't taught formally, yet it spread through practice like a skill remembered rather than learned. Daphne noticed how conversations unfolded differently now. People left sentences unfinished. Others didn't rush to complete them. Silence was no longer a failure of communication. It was part of it. Public spaces reflected this change. Museums added quiet rooms. Workplaces introduced unscheduled pauses. Even broadcasts began including intentional moments with no sound, no commentary. At first they felt awkward. Then they felt necessary. The world was learning to listen to itself. Daphne spent more time walking, not for exercise, not to clear her head, but to be present among movement that asked nothing of her. Trees, streets, passing faces, everything carried information when given time. One afternoon, she sat beside a woman on a park bench. They didn't exchange names. They didn't speak for a long while. Finally, the woman said, "It's strange. I feel like something is still happening." Daphne nodded. "It is, but there's nothing to point to." "That doesn't mean it stopped," Daphne replied. They shared a small smile, then returned to silence. Across the globe, similar exchanges occurred. People connected without urgency, without narrative. The need to frame every experience into a story weakened. Some historians would later struggle with this period. There were fewer milestones, fewer declarations. Change didn't announce itself. It accumulated. Daphne felt it when she realized she hadn't checked the sky in weeks. Not out of avoidance, out of trust. Whatever had begun there was no longer confined to above. One night, during a power outage, the city went dark. Streets emptied. Windows glowed with candlelight. The stars emerged sharper than they had been in years. People stepped outside quietly. No one filmed. No one spoke loudly. Daphne stood among them, feeling the shared stillness stretch wide. There were no lights in the sky, and yet the presence was unmistakable. Not external, not observing, integrated. The long listening had not been preparation for a return. It had been preparation for continuity. Daphne breathed in the cool air and felt grounded in a way she had never known before. Nothing needed to arrive. Nothing needed to be answered. The listening itself was the change. The test did not arrive as a challenge. There were no warnings, no signs in the sky, no sense of judgment. It came disguised as something familiar. Pressure. A global shortage emerged slowly at first, then all at once. Supply chains tightened. Resources became uneven. Old systems, long held together by speed and excess, began to strain. The world felt its old instincts stir. Daphne watched the news carefully, not with fear, but with attention. The language was familiar: urgency, competition, blame, the reflexes of a faster time. But something else moved beneath it. Communities responded differently than before. Instead of hoarding, people organized quietly. Local networks formed overnight. Sharing replaced stockpiling, not because it was noble, but because it worked. Daphne volunteered at a distribution center set up in a school gym. No banners, no slogans, just lists on paper and calm coordination. People took what they needed and left space for the next person. There were arguments. Frustration didn't vanish. But escalation felt harder now, like pushing against a current moving the other way. In meetings between nations, the tone shifted. Negotiations slowed, less posturing, more listening. It wasn't unity, but it was restraint under stress. Daphne recognized the moment for what it was. Not a trial imposed from above, a mirror. The lights did not return during the shortage, not once. The sky remained silent, empty, unchanged. And yet their absence felt meaningful, as if the world had been left alone on purpose. Weeks passed. Systems adapted. The crisis eased without collapsing into chaos. Not cleanly, not perfectly, but with fewer fractures than anyone had expected. When it was over, there were no celebrations, just a shared sense of having passed through something quietly important. Daphne walked home one evening as the city returned to its rhythm. Streetlights flickered on, stores reopened fully, life resumed. She paused, looking up out of old habit. The sky was clear. She didn't wait for anything to appear. Whatever trust had been placed in humanity had not been withdrawn. It had been tested and held. After the pressure eased, the world did not rush to fill the space it left behind. There was a collective hesitation, a sense that returning to old habits too quickly might undo something fragile. Daphne felt it in the quiet that lingered, not emptiness, integration, as if what had been tested was still being absorbed. Cities reopened fully, but not loudly. Grand openings felt unnecessary. Efficiency remained, but urgency no longer dominated. People seemed more willing to wait, to negotiate, to adjust. The shortage became a reference point, not as a crisis, but as proof. Proof that restraint could scale, that cooperation did not require spectacle. Daphne attended a small gathering at the library where she volunteered. No agenda, no speaker, just people reflecting together. Someone mentioned how different it had felt this time. We didn't collapse, they said. We adapted. No one argued. Across institutions, subtle reforms took root. Emergency response plans emphasized local autonomy. Education systems allowed more open-ended time. Mental health support shifted toward prevention rather than recovery. Nothing dramatic. Everything meaningful. Daphne noticed she was sleeping differently, deeper, without the tight edge that used to sit beneath rest. Dreams came and went, but none stayed long enough to demand interpretation. One evening, while walking home, she passed a street musician playing a slow, simple melody. People gathered without crowding. Coins dropped quietly into an open case. The music ended, no applause followed, just a shared moment of appreciation before everyone moved on. Daphne smiled. She understood. That night, for the first time in a long while, she looked up with intention. The sky was unchanged. She didn't feel disappointment. She felt confirmation. Whatever had been needed from above had already been given. What remained was the work of living it. Daphne closed her window and turned out the light, carrying the stillness with her. Not as a memory, as a practice. The most surprising thing was how quickly the extraordinary became ordinary, not forgotten, not dismissed, just woven into daily life until it no longer stood apart. Daphne saw it in small habits. People paused before crossing streets, not out of caution, but awareness. Conversations began with a breath. Endings felt less abrupt. There was a shared sense that rushing through moments meant missing something essential. Nothing announced this change. There was no movement to join, no rules to follow. It lived quietly in choices no one applauded. In offices, conflicts still arose, but voices lowered sooner. In homes, silences stretched without turning heavy. Families learned to sit together without filling every gap with noise. Daphne's days felt fuller even when they contained less. She cooked simple meals and ate them slowly. She read fewer books but remembered them better. Time felt wide enough to rest inside. One afternoon, while volunteering, she helped a child find a book. The child looked up and asked, Was it scary when the lights came? Daphne thought carefully before answering. No, she said. It was careful. The child nodded, as if that explained everything. Across the world, anniversaries passed quietly. No official remembrances, no global moments of silence. People remembered in their own ways when it felt right. Some wrote letters they never sent. Some planted trees. Some simply stood still at dusk. Daphne marked the day by doing nothing special. She walked the long way home, watching shadows stretch across the pavement. The sky was clear, empty, familiar. She realized then that the greatest change was not how humanity related to the unknown, it was how it related to itself. That night, she sat by the window, not waiting, not listening for anything beyond the ordinary sounds of the city. Cars passed. A dog barked somewhere. Life continued. And within that continuation, the quiet remained. Not imposed, not fragile, earned. Daphne turned away from the window and let the night be just a night. The new ordinary held. By the time anyone noticed that chapter 18 had passed without ceremony, it already felt appropriate. Not everything needed to be counted anymore. Some things simply continued. Daphne thought about that often, what people chose to keep when nothing forced their hand. They kept the pauses. They kept the listening. They kept the understanding that not every silence was empty. What they slowly let go of surprised her more. The constant need to explain, the pressure to react instantly, the belief that visibility meant importance. None of it disappeared completely, but it loosened like a grip finally aware it could release without losing control. Daphne saw it one morning on a crowded train. A delay was announced. Once, this would have triggered irritation, complaints, a ripple of tension. Instead, people shifted their weight, checked on one another, settled back into waiting. Someone laughed softly. Someone offered a seat. The moment passed without friction. She realized then that whatever had happened with the lights had never been about teaching humanity something new. It had reminded them of something old. Later that week, Daphne received a message from the forum, now quieter, nearly dormant. No sightings, no updates. Just a simple question posted by someone she didn't recognize. What are you doing with the space it left? Daphne didn't answer right away. That evening she cooked dinner slowly. She ate by the window, watching the city settle into night. She noticed how familiar everything felt, and how that familiarity no longer carried boredom. Afterward, she typed her reply. I'm protecting it. She closed the forum for the last time. Outside, the sky was clear, not expectant, not distant, just present, the way it had always been. Daphne stood for a moment, breathing evenly. If the lights never returned, it would not mean the connection had ended. It would mean it had succeeded. She turned off the light and let the dark fill the room gently. Some things, once chosen, did not need to be revisited. They needed to be lived. The idea of an ending never quite fit what had unfolded. There was no final moment to point to, no clear line where one chapter closed and another began. What existed instead was continuity. Daphne felt it on a quiet morning as she opened her window. The city stretched awake below her, unremarkable and alive. People moved through their routines. Shops opened. Birds crossed the pale sky. Nothing signaled significance, and yet everything carried it. The world had not become gentler by accident. It had practiced gentleness until it held. It had learned that attention could be given without taking, that presence did not require proof. History books would struggle with this period. There were no dates bold enough to underline, no single image to print on a page. What mattered most had left no artifact behind. Only behavior. Daphne walked through her neighborhood, noticing how familiar faces had softened, how greetings lingered a second longer, how disagreements rarely rushed toward victory anymore. Progress still existed. Ambition still lived. But they no longer stood alone. At the edge of the city, she stopped where land opened wide and the sky felt endless again. She stood there for a long time, not waiting, not remembering, just sharing the space. She understood now that the horizon was not a boundary. It was a meeting point. Whatever had watched, whatever had listened, had never asked to be followed. It had asked to be met halfway, in stillness, in care, in restraint. Humanity had answered, not perfectly, not forever, but sincerely. And sincerity, she sensed, was enough. As evening approached, the sky deepened into familiar shades of blue and gold. No lights appeared. No signals broke the calm. Daphne smiled. The silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like agreement. She turned back toward home, carrying nothing extraordinary, only the quiet knowledge that the world had learned how to hold itself differently. The horizon remained, shared. Life settled into the intervals, not the events themselves, but the spaces around them, the moments before a choice, the breath after a sentence, the pause between waking and remembering what needed to be done. Daphne noticed how much of her life now existed there. Mornings began without alarm more often than not. Even when schedules waited, she allowed herself a few quiet seconds before rising. The day felt less like an obligation and more like an unfolding. Across the city, similar rhythms emerged. People walked a little slower, not out of fatigue, but intention. Traffic still moved, but with fewer horns. Lines formed without tension. Waiting had lost its edge. Daphne returned to the library on a rainy afternoon. The windows were fogged, the outside world softened into blur. Inside, readers sat scattered, each wrapped in their own quiet focus. She realized then that focus itself had changed. It no longer felt narrow or strained. It felt open, receptive, as if attention could rest on something without gripping it. That evening she met Emery for dinner. They spoke of small things, a recipe, a neighbor, a memory from childhood. There was no need to bring up the sky. It was understood. "Do you ever worry we'll forget?" Emery asked as they finished their meal. Daphne considered the question. "I think forgetting would look different now," she said. "It wouldn't mean losing it." He nodded, satisfied. Later, walking home, Daphne paused on a bridge and looked down at the water moving steadily beneath her. The river didn't rush, it didn't stop, it continued, shaped by the land but not owned by it. The thought stayed with her. Memory, she realized, didn't need constant recall, it needed integration. That night, she slept lightly and woke just before dawn. The sky outside was pale, empty, unchanged. She felt no pull to search it. The space between days had become wide enough to live in, and within that space, nothing felt missing. The year turned without announcement. No one marked it as special, and that felt right. Calendars flipped, seasons adjusted. Life continued with its familiar mix of routine and surprise. Daphne felt the shift not in events, but in how endings behaved. They no longer felt sharp. Conversations tapered instead of stopping. Goodbyes softened into until next time. Even grief carried more room to breathe. She noticed it during a memorial service for a neighbor. There were tears, yes, but also long silences that didn't rush to be filled. People sat together afterward, sharing simple food, letting memory move at its own pace. Continuity had replaced closure. At the library, Daphne helped reorganize a section that had slowly grown out of date. Old labels no longer fit, categories blurred. The change wasn't dramatic enough to announce, but it mattered. So much of the world, she realized, had been built around edges, beginnings, endings, answers. Now more things lived in between. One evening, Lena sent a message after months of quiet. Sometimes I wonder if this is what they hoped for, she wrote. Daphne typed, then paused, then erased. Finally, she replied, I don't think hope was the point. I think presence was. The reply came quickly. That feels right. Daphne set the phone aside and stepped out onto her balcony. The air was cool. The sky was empty and calm. She rested her hands on the railing and breathed. Nothing stirred above. Nothing needed to. The continuum was gentle, carrying moments forward without demanding they arrive anywhere specific. Daphne smiled to herself. This wasn't a story moving toward an ending. It was a life learning how to continue. The question of enough had once haunted people. Enough progress, enough security, enough proof. The world had been built on reaching for more, even when it no longer knew why. Now the question felt different. Daphne noticed it while cleaning her apartment. She paused over objects she hadn't touched in months. Not with guilt, with clarity. Some things stayed. Others left without ceremony. Enough was not less. It was fit. Across the city, similar adjustments unfolded. Stores carried fewer options, menus shortened, choices simplified. Not by restriction, but by preference. People discovered relief in deciding once and living with it. Daphne met Emre at a small market on a Saturday morning. They wandered without lists, choosing what felt right rather than what promised value. I used to think enough meant stopping, Emery said. Now it feels like settling. Daphne smiled. Settling in, she corrected. They laughed softly. Later, Daphne volunteered at a community meal. Long tables, simple food, unhurried conversation. No speeches, no announcements. Just presence shared across differences that no longer demanded constant explanation. Someone asked her if she thought the lights would ever return. Daphne considered the question honestly. If they do, she said, I don't think it will change much. The person nodded, as if that made sense. That night, Daphne stood by her window as dusk settled. The city lights flickered on, steady and familiar. The sky above remained quiet. She felt no longing. Enough, she realized, was not a state you reached. It was a relationship you maintained. And that relationship was holding. There came a point when Daphne stopped noticing the changes as changes. They had settled into her like a center of gravity, something everything else quietly orbited. She felt it when unexpected problems arose. Her first response was no longer resistance, but orientation. Where am I standing? What matters here? The questions arrived naturally, without effort. The city reflected this shift. Construction continued, but with more care. Growth still happened, but it bent around existing spaces instead of erasing them. Old trees stayed, narrow streets remained narrow. Progress learned how to listen. Daphne spent an afternoon helping reorganize a small community center. Nothing glamorous. Folding chairs, sorting supplies, painting a wall back to its original color. The work felt grounding. While painting, a young volunteer asked her, "Do you think this calm will last?" Daphne didn't answer right away. She dipped her brush, considered the slow drip of paint. "I think calm isn't something that lasts," she said finally. "It's something you return to." The volunteer nodded, thoughtful. That evening, Daphne sat on her balcony as the city dimmed. She didn't scan the sky. She didn't expect anything. Her attention rested inward, steady. The quiet center held. It didn't erase uncertainty. It didn't promise ease. It offered balance. And balance, she had learned, was enough to begin again each day. Some changes arrived without making any noise at all. No announcements, no visible markers. They moved through people the way breath moved through a room, unnoticed until suddenly everything felt different. Daphne sensed it in her body before her thoughts caught up. Tension left her shoulders more easily. Her breathing deepened without instruction. She stood more often than she sat, not from restlessness, but readiness. The world felt less brittle. In public spaces, conflicts still surfaced, but they dissolved faster. Not because people agreed, but because disagreement no longer felt like a threat to belonging. Daphne watched this one afternoon at a busy intersection. Two cyclists nearly collided. Voices rose, then fell. One laughed awkwardly, the other nodded. They moved on. No winner, no story. That night, Daphne dreamed of motion without friction, shapes passing through one another, adjusting, continuing, no impact, no loss of form. When she woke, the dream felt instructional rather than symbolic. At the library, a man returned a book he hadn't finished. "I didn't need to," he said simply. Daphne understood. The sky remained unchanged, empty, calm, but it no longer registered as absence. It felt like space deliberately left open. Daphne realized then that movement no longer required noise to be real. Some of the most important shifts were the ones you could only feel once they were already inside you. And once inside, they stayed. What surprised Daphne most was not how much the world had changed, but how familiar she felt to herself again. Not younger, not simpler, just aligned. She noticed it in the mirror one morning. Her face held the same lines, the same expressions, but something behind them had settled. A kind of inner quiet that didn't require effort to maintain. Across the city, people spoke more honestly about exhaustion, not as a weakness, but as information. Rest was no longer something earned only after productivity. It was part of staying whole. Daphne took a day off without explanation. She walked without destination, letting her feet choose the direction. The city offered small gifts: a cat stretched in sunlight, a bakery window fogged with warmth, a stranger held a door without hurry. None of it felt extraordinary. And that was the point. She realized she had stopped performing her life. no longer narrating it internally, no longer measuring it against imagined expectations. She was inhabiting it. That evening, she sat by the window with a cup of tea. The sky faded from blue to indigo. No lights appeared. No signals came. She didn't notice their absence. Her attention rested where it belonged, within. Quiet was no longer something that happened when noise stopped. It had become a living thing, present even in motion, even in sound. Daphne felt it on a crowded morning train. Conversations overlapped, doors opened and closed. The city moved at full speed. And yet, beneath it all, there was a steadiness that hadn't been there before. People carried their own quiet with them now. She saw it in how eyes met briefly and then released, in how apologies came faster, in how mistakes were corrected without shame. At the library, a group of students studied together without speaking. Notes passed, pages turned. Understanding moved between them without explanation. Daphne smiled to herself. That afternoon, rain fell unexpectedly. Instead of rushing for cover, people slowed. Some stopped entirely, faces lifted, letting the water touch them. Laughter rippled gently, then settled. The rain passed. No one spoke about it afterward. That night, Daphne dreamed of a room filled with soft light but no source. The light didn't illuminate objects, it illuminated space itself. When she woke, the feeling stayed. The living quiet did not demand attention. It offered support. And support, she realized, was the rarest kind of presence. Trust had changed shape. It was no longer something extended cautiously, fingers half closed. It had become an open hand, offered without insistence. Daphne noticed it in small exchanges. A borrowed book returned late without apology. A favor given without keeping score. A disagreement left unresolved without feeling unfinished. The open hand did not demand certainty. It allowed movement. One afternoon, Daphne helped a neighbor carry groceries upstairs. They spoke briefly, then not at all. The shared effort was enough. Later, sitting alone, Daphne thought about how much energy had once gone into guarding herself, into anticipating outcomes, into protecting imagined futures. The guarding had softened, not because danger had vanished, but because presence had grown stronger. At the library, a child asked her, "How do you know when something is okay?" Daphne considered the question carefully. "When you can let it be what it is," she said. The child nodded, satisfied in a way that surprised her. That evening, Daphne stood by the window as dusk settled. The sky remained quiet, wide, unchanged. She didn't look for meaning there anymore. She carried it with her. The open hand stayed open. Not everything moved forward with the same ease. Some memories resisted integration. Some habits clung longer than others. But even these were held differently now, with less judgment, more patience. Daphne felt it when old worries surfaced without warning. Instead of pushing them away, she noticed them, named them, let them pass. They no longer defined the direction of her days. Carrying forward did not mean carrying everything. Across the city, people began choosing what deserved weight. Traditions were kept or released with intention. Celebrations grew simpler. Conversations deepened even when they stayed brief. Daphne attended a small gathering one evening, no occasion attached to it. Friends, neighbors, familiar faces. They shared food, stories, long pauses. Someone laughed mid-sentence and forgot why. No one needed to finish the thought. Later, walking home, Daphne realized she felt lighter, not because she had lost something, but because she had stopped carrying what no longer belonged to her. The sky above was clear, unchanged, indifferent in the best way. It didn't demand belief or attention. It simply was. Daphne understood then that whatever had passed through humanity had left no instructions to follow, only a direction to keep choosing. Presence, care, enough. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, carrying forward only what felt true, and that was sufficient. Forward no longer meant faster, it meant steadier. It meant moving without abandoning what had been learned along the way. Daphne felt it on an ordinary morning. She woke, made coffee, opened the window. The city breathed below her, familiar and alive. Nothing asked for urgency. Nothing demanded attention. She moved through her day with a quiet confidence that didn't need reassurance. Decisions came more easily now, not because they were simpler, but because they were rooted. At the library, a new volunteer asked her how long she planned to stay. Daphne smiled. As long as it makes sense. The answer surprised them both. Around the world, similar choices accumulated. People stayed where care existed. They left when it didn't. Not dramatically, just honestly. Progress continued, but it learned how to pause. Innovation slowed enough to ask questions before answering them. Growth learned to notice what it touched. Daphne walked home at dusk, watching the sky change color. No lights appeared. No signs arrived. She didn't feel watched. She didn't feel alone. She felt accompanied by what had settled inside her and so many others. The still forward was not a destination. It was a way of moving that didn't forget where it stood. Daphne turned the key, stepped inside, and let the day close gently behind her. Tomorrow would come, and it would be met. Nothing announced itself as new anymore. Change arrived quietly, folded into routine, indistinguishable from ordinary life until it had already taken hold. Daphne felt it in how easily she adapted. When plans shifted, she adjusted without resistance. When uncertainty appeared, she met it without tightening. The future no longer felt like something to manage. It felt like something to meet. The city mirrored this ease. Construction crews worked shorter hours. Neighborhood councils listened longer. Solutions emerged slowly, but they lasted. Daphne spent an afternoon helping organize a small reading circle at the library. No theme, no objectives. People arrived, opened books, closed them again. Some read aloud, others simply listened. The room felt complete. A visitor asked her if this was part of a program. No, Daphne said. It's just what's happening. That night, walking home beneath a sky washed clean by recent rain, she realized how rarely she thought about beginnings or endings now. Life had become a series of continuations, each one gentle enough to carry the last. At her window, she paused, not to look for anything, but to acknowledge the habit she no longer needed. The sky was empty, wide, familiar. She smiled. The continuation did not require witnesses. It required care. Daphne turned away from the glass and let the night be what it was. Quiet, ordinary, sufficient. And in that sufficiency, everything kept going. Days began to take on a shape Daphne could recognize without naming. Not rigid, not loose, just held. Morning, afternoon, evening moved like parts of a single breath. She noticed how little effort it took now to move from one thing to the next. There was no mental clutter to clear, no urgency to justify. Tasks unfolded, then released her. At the library, she reorganized a small shelf that had been overlooked for years. No one had asked her to. It simply felt ready. The work took less than an hour, but the satisfaction lingered all day. People had begun trusting intuition again, not as impulse, but as accumulated understanding. Decisions made this way tended to fit, even when they surprised. Daphne met Lena for tea after months apart. They spoke easily as if no time had passed. Gaps no longer required explanation. I used to think consistency meant repeating myself, Lena said. Now it feels more like staying in touch. Daphne nodded. That felt right. As evening settled, Daphne walked home through streets softened by lamplight. The sky above remained unchanged, vast and silent. She didn't look up out of habit anymore. When she did, it was simply to notice beauty, not to search for meaning. The shape of days had become trustworthy, not because they promised anything, but because they held what arrived. Connection no longer required effort. It formed where attention rested, without needing to be pulled together. Daphne noticed this in conversations that drifted naturally into silence and stayed there without discomfort, in friendships that didn't demand regular proof, in relationships that survived distance without thinning. The unforced bond didn't depend on proximity. It depended on honesty. At the library, a man she barely knew handed her a note. Not a request, not a complaint, just a thought he wanted someone else to carry for a while. She read it, nodded, and placed it in a small box behind the desk. What happens to them? She asked herself later. They're held, she decided. That afternoon, a power outage dimmed the building. No one rushed to leave. People adjusted, reading by window light, talking quietly. The pause felt intentional, even though it wasn't planned. Daphne felt a calm responsibility, not to fix the moment, but to stay present inside it. When the lights returned, no one applauded. The bond had already done its work. Walking home, Daphne realized that connection no longer felt like a bridge stretched between separate islands. It felt like ground shared. The sky above remained open and quiet. Nothing descended. Nothing needed to. The bond held. Rest had once been something Daphne negotiated with herself, a reward after effort, a pause that needed justification. Now rest arrived without argument. She felt it one afternoon when her body simply asked to stop, not from exhaustion, but from completion. The task was done. The moment was full. She closed her book, leaned back, and let the quiet take over. Across the city, similar permissions were being granted. Offices shortened hours without announcing it as policy. Meetings ended early when nothing more needed saying. People left gatherings before fatigue arrived, and no one took it personally. Rest no longer felt like absence. It felt like participation in a slower rhythm. Daphne noticed how this changed care. When people were rested, they listened better. When they listened, fewer things escalated. When fewer things escalated, the world softened incrementally. That evening, she cooked a simple meal and ate it slowly. No screen, no background noise, just the sound of cutlery, the hum of the building, her own breathing. The sky outside faded as usual. No signal, no interruption. She didn't miss anything. Rest, she realized, was not stepping away from life. It was life recognizing its own limits and honoring them. Urgency had once shaped Daphne's inner landscape. Even in stillness, something had always pressed forward, demanding response. Now, urgency appeared only when it belonged. She noticed it one morning when a sudden problem arose at the library. A system failure, delayed access, mild confusion. Her body didn't tense. Her thoughts stayed clear. They fixed what could be fixed. They waited where they had to. No panic followed. Across the city, similar reactions played out. Trains delayed, deliveries rescheduled. Life adjusted without spiraling. The absence of urgency did not mean indifference. It meant discernment. Daphne realized how much energy had once been spent responding to false alarms. Imagined futures, social expectations, internalized timelines. Those alarms were quiet now. That afternoon, she sat with an elderly woman who simply wanted company. No advice, no conversation goals, just presence shared. Time passed without shape. When Daphne left, the woman smiled and said, "Thank you for not rushing." Walking home, Daphne felt the weight of that sentence. When nothing is urgent, attention becomes generous. The sky above remained silent, unchanged. Daphne did not look up for reassurance. She trusted the pace she was moving at, and that was enough. Something subtle aligned between people. Not agreement, not sameness, but pace. Conversations found a rhythm that didn't rush ahead or lag behind. Work moved at a speed that felt humane. Daphne noticed it during a neighborhood walk, organized without agenda. People showed up, started walking, adjusted naturally to one another. Faster walkers drifted ahead. Slower ones formed small clusters. No one tried to manage it. The shared pace emerged on its own. At the library, this rhythm showed itself in how help was offered. Not immediately, not withheld. Just at the moment it was needed. Questions were answered fully, without excess explanation. Daphne felt less drained at the end of the day, even when she'd done more. Efficiency had quietly divorced urgency. One evening, she sat with Emery on a park bench. They watched children play, leaves fall, light shift. Minutes passed without commentary. "This feels new," Emery said finally. "It feels remembered," Daphne replied. The difference mattered. The sky above them stayed open and quiet. It didn't draw attention to itself. It didn't interrupt the moment. The shared pace didn't erase individuality. It gave it room. As Daphne walked home later, she realized she no longer felt pulled forward or held back by time. She was moving with it. And time, at last, seemed willing to keep her company. Stopping no longer felt like interruption. It felt like recognition. Daphne noticed it after a full day that had gone exactly as planned. Nothing remarkable had happened, no conflict, no revelation. And yet when she sat down in the evening, there was a fullness that didn't ask for more. She let herself stop. Not collapse, not retreat, just stop. The city seemed to understand. Windows glowed softly. Conversations lowered themselves without being asked. Somewhere, music played quietly enough to blend with the night rather than dominate it. Daphne thought about how much of life used to be spent in preparation, for later, for better, for finally. Now, preparation had loosened its grip. Moments were allowed to be complete on their own. At the library, she had started ending her days the same way. One last look around, shelves in order, lights dimmed, a pause before leaving. Not to check for mistakes, to acknowledge completion. That night, she sat by the window again, not out of habit, out of choice. The sky was there, as it always was, open, silent, uninterested in explanation. She didn't feel small beneath it. She felt placed. What remained when she stopped striving was not emptiness. It was alignment. And alignment, she had learned, did not fade when effort ended. It stayed, quietly, reliably. Enough. The horizon had changed, though nothing visible marked the shift. It no longer pulled Daphne forward with promise or threat. It simply existed, soft and patient. She felt it during a long walk at the edge of the city, where buildings gave way to open land. The distance no longer represented something she needed to reach. It was just space, allowed to be. People had begun planning differently, fewer long-term guarantees, more adaptable intentions. The future wasn't dismissed, it was held lightly. At the library, Daphne helped a student who wasn't sure what she wanted to study. Instead of advice, Daphne offered curiosity. "What draws you when no one is watching?" she asked. The student smiled, surprised. The question stayed with her longer than any answer might have. That evening, Daphne noticed how rarely she imagined herself elsewhere now. Not because she felt trapped, but because the present no longer felt like a placeholder. The sky dimmed gradually. No signals appeared. No interruption came. The horizon stayed where it was. Not calling, not receding, just waiting in kindest way. And Daphne, for the first time she could remember, felt no need to meet it halfway. There was a quiet courage in staying, not holding on, not giving up, just remaining present with what already existed. Daphne felt it one afternoon when an unexpected feeling surfaced. Not sadness exactly, not joy. Something in between. In the past, she might have tried to name it, trace it, resolve it. This time, she stayed with it. The feeling moved, shifted, softened on its own. Around her, people were doing the same. Emotions were no longer treated like problems to solve. They were allowed to be signals, weather passing through. At the library, a woman sat for hours without opening a book. No one asked her to move. She wasn't in the way. She was where she needed to be. Daphne realized how much pressure had once existed to turn every moment into something useful. Now, usefulness had widened to include stillness, reflection, even uncertainty. That evening she cooked slowly, tasting as she went. She ate when she was hungry. She stopped when she was full. Simple, attentive, enough. The sky outside held its usual quiet. Daphne glanced at it briefly, then turned back to the room she was in. Staying with what is did not mean settling for less. It meant trusting that this moment, unpolished, incomplete, was already doing its work. And that work, she felt, was gentle. By now, continuation had become instinctive. Daphne no longer asked herself whether to move forward. She simply did, in the same way one step follows another without negotiation. She noticed it during a week that offered nothing special. No milestones, no disruptions, just days that arrived, unfolded, and closed again. And still, she felt engaged. Ease did not dull attention, it refined it. At the library, a regular visitor stopped coming. No explanation, no farewell. Daphne felt the absence, acknowledged it, and let it settle. Some connections were meant to change shape without warning. Elsewhere, new ones formed just as quietly. The city carried on with this same ease. Repairs were made without spectacle. Help was offered without announcement. People adjusted to one another with fewer words. Daphne realized how much energy had once been spent bracing for impact. Now she moved without armor, not because the world had become harmless, but because she had learned how to meet it. That evening, she walked home as the sky shifted through its familiar colors. She didn't stop to watch. She let the transition accompany her. Continuing no longer felt like effort. It felt like trust, practiced daily. Daphne unlocked her door, stepped inside, and let the day rest. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, and she would meet it without strain. Confidence had changed its tone. It no longer announced itself or waited to be confirmed. It lived quietly, woven into Daphne's movements and choices. She felt it when she said no without apology, when she said yes without overthinking, when she allowed uncertainty to remain unanswered. The city reflected this shift in subtle ways. People trusted their judgments more. They asked fewer questions meant to reassure and more meant to understand. Authority softened into guidance. At the library, Daphne watched a young reader choose a book, hesitate, then put it back and select another. No anxiety, no second guessing, just adjustment. That simple act felt emblematic. Confidence, Daphne realized, wasn't certainty. It was flexibility without fear. Later she met Emery for a walk. They spoke about nothing urgent. They walked at the same pace without discussing it. When they parted, there was no need to promise to meet again. They trusted that they would. That evening, Daphne stood by the window one last time before sleep. The sky was as it had been for months, open, silent, unchanged. She no longer searched it for meaning. She carried her own. Quiet confidence did not need reinforcement. It held, and it stayed. Some things didn't resolve. They settled. Daphne noticed this in conversations that ended without conclusions, in questions that stayed open without causing discomfort. The need to tie everything together had loosened. Life felt less like a series of problems to be solved and more like a surface that gradually found its level. At the library, a box of donated books arrived without a list. No one rushed to catalog them immediately. They were unpacked slowly over days, each book handled with brief curiosity, then placed where it seemed to belong. Nothing forced, nothing wasted. Daphne felt the same process inside herself. Old expectations shifted position. Some beliefs sank quietly out of reach. Others surfaced gently, asking to be acknowledged again. She didn't hurry the process. In the evenings, the city grew still earlier, not from fatigue, but from contentment. Lights dimmed, voices softened, windows stayed open longer. The sky above remained unchanged, but Daphne no longer thought of it as watching. It was simply part of the environment, vast, neutral, present. She realized then that settling wasn't stagnation. It was alignment finding its depth. Daphne turned off the light, lay down, and let the day rest exactly where it was. Nothing needed to be added. Nothing needed to be removed. The way things were had found their place. It felt as though the world had taken a long breath in and was finally letting it out. Daphne noticed it not in silence but in sound. Laughter that lingered a second longer. Conversations that ended naturally instead of trailing into obligation. Even the city noises felt less sharp, more rounded. The long exhale was collective. She felt it one afternoon when a mistake at the library caused mild inconvenience. In the past, it might have sparked frustration. Now, it produced a shrug, a shared smile, a simple adjustment. No problem, someone said, and meant it. Daphne realized how rare that sincerity used to be. People had begun allowing margin again, for error, for rest, for not knowing. Schedules loosened just enough to breathe inside them. That evening, Daphne walked slowly, not because she was tired, but because she didn't feel chased. Streetlights flickered on. The air cooled. The day released her. She stopped on the sidewalk, closed her eyes for a moment, and inhaled deeply. Then she let it go. The sky remained quiet, unchanged, vast. It did not respond. It didn't need to. The exhale carried its own relief. And in that release, Daphne understood something simple and true. The world wasn't ending. It was unclenching. And so was she. What came after release was not emptiness, but holding, a gentler kind than before. Not grip, not control, just enough presence to keep things from slipping away unnoticed. Daphne felt it in the way days now carried her instead of the other way around. She didn't have to push herself through them. She stepped into them, and they adjusted around her weight. At the library, a child fell asleep at a table, head resting on folded arms. No one woke them. A jacket was placed over their shoulders. The room shifted slightly to protect the moment. This was how things were held now. Care appeared without announcement. Attention moved where it was needed, then withdrew without leaving marks. People trusted one another to notice. Daphne realized she no longer feared being dropped by life. Even when things loosened, there was space beneath her, room to land, room to rest. That evening she sat quietly, hands open in her lap, feeling the simple fact of being supported. Not by guarantees, by presence. The sky outside remained wide and indifferent, but it no longer felt cold. It was simply part of the larger holding, one layer among many. Daphne closed her eyes and let herself be where she was. Nothing pressed. Nothing pulled. The gentle holding remained. And within it, everything stayed. There were things Daphne realized she had quietly stopped chasing. Not because she had given up, but because the chase itself no longer made sense. Approval. Certainty. The feeling of being ahead. They had slipped out of her hands without struggle. She noticed it when an old opportunity resurfaced, something she once would have reached for immediately. This time, she felt no pull. She wished it well and let it pass. The city echoed this shift. Fewer people hurried for appearances. Fewer arguments were framed as victories to be won. Success lost its sharp edges and became something broader, more personal. At the library, Daphne listened as two visitors debated gently, then laughed when neither convinced the other. They parted smiling. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing needed to be. That evening, Daphne walked home as dusk settled softly. She realized how much lighter her steps felt without the weight of pursuit. When nothing is being chased, attention returns to what is already here. The sky above stayed quiet, unchanged. It no longer represented distance or mystery. It was simply part of the landscape. Daphne unlocked her door, stepped inside, and felt no sense of arrival or departure, only presence. What she no longer chased had made room for something else. Enough. When the chasing stopped, space opened. Not the kind that felt empty or exposed, but a space with air in it, room to turn around, to stretch, to notice what had been crowded out before. Daphne felt it most clearly in her thoughts. They no longer stacked on top of one another, competing for attention. One arrived, stayed briefly, then left without pushing the next aside. Mental quiet had texture now. At the library, she rearranged a table closer to the window. No reason she could name. The light fell better there. People lingered longer. Conversation softened. The room breathed easier. Small changes carried weight. Daphne realized that space wasn't created by removing everything. It was created by removing what didn't belong. That evening, she sat on the floor with her back against the couch, doing nothing in particular. The absence of agenda felt like a gift she was finally allowing herself to receive. Outside, the city continued at its steady pace. Inside, Daphne felt a widening calm that didn't ask to be filled. The sky remained as it had been, open, silent, distant. It no longer represented anything missing. It mirrored what had opened within her. And in that space, Daphne understood. Life didn't need to be fuller. It needed to be spacious. There was no moment when everyone agreed, no meeting, no shared declaration. And yet something like an agreement had settled between people. Not about beliefs, not about direction, about tone. Daphne felt it in how easily misunderstandings were released, how often people chose generosity over being right, how silence was allowed to finish a thought instead of being interrupted. The quiet agreement wasn't spoken, it was practiced. At the library, a disagreement arose over space. Two people wanted the same table. Voices stayed calm. One shrugged, smiled, chose another spot. No one kept score. Daphne watched the exchange with a small sense of wonder. So much effort had once gone into proving, defending, asserting. Now, many seemed to sense when something wasn't worth tightening around. That evening, Daphne shared a meal with friends. Someone changed their mind halfway through a story. Someone else forgot theirs entirely. Laughter filled the gaps without embarrassment. Nothing felt unfinished. Walking home, Daphne noticed the night air felt lighter. Or maybe she was lighter inside it. The distinction no longer mattered. The sky above was unchanged, vast and quiet. It didn't press meaning onto the world below. The agreement didn't need witnesses. It lived in everyday choices, in softened responses, in the shared understanding that not everything had to be resolved. Daphne unlocked her door and stepped inside, carrying that agreement with her. It wasn't fragile. It was already holding. Daphne couldn't say exactly when the weight had lifted. There was no single memory to point to, no moment she could circle and name. It was more like realizing mid-step that you're no longer carrying something you forgot you put down. She felt it in her body first. Her jaw unclenched. Her hands rested open instead of curled. Even standing still felt easier, as if gravity had softened its hold just for her. Around her, the world seemed to echo that lightness. People moved with fewer sharp edges. Words landed without thudding. Expectations loosened enough to let curiosity in. At the library, a regular visitor asked if things felt different lately. Daphne thought for a moment. They feel lighter, she said. Not simpler, just less heavy. The visitor nodded, relieved, as if that was permission to feel the same. That evening, Daphne walked without destination. She turned corners on impulse, followed streets she didn't usually take. Nothing remarkable happened, and that felt like reward. The sky above was clear, silent, unchanged. It no longer felt like a ceiling or a question. It felt like space. When Daphne finally returned home, she sat for a while before turning on the light. She noticed how little she needed in that moment. Breath, stillness, a sense of being unburdened. The weight hadn't vanished. It had been set down, and in its absence, Daphne discovered she was already strong enough to continue. What surprised Daphne most was how ordinary everything looked once the weight was gone. Streets were the same. Buildings stood where they always had. People carried bags, worries, groceries, memories. Nothing sparkled. Nothing announced itself. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. The miracle was not in change, but in perception. Daphne noticed it while waiting in line at a small shop. The pause didn't irritate her. It didn't feel stolen. It felt like part of the day, woven in naturally. She watched dust float in a beam of light, listened to a quiet conversation behind her. This too belonged. At the library, she helped a child find a book they couldn't quite describe. They wandered the shelves together until the child suddenly stopped. This one, they said, certain. Daphne smiled. She hadn't chosen it. She had simply stayed present long enough for the choice to appear. That evening she cooked with whatever was left in the fridge. The meal wasn't planned. It wasn't perfect. It was enough. She ate slowly, aware of each bite, each small satisfaction. Outside, the sky remained silent and unchanged. It offered no sign, no message, no promise. And for the first time, Daphne understood that this was not a lack. It was freedom. The ordinary miracle was not something added to life. It was what life became when nothing was in the way. Reaching the middle did not feel like crossing a line. There was no sense of distance covered, no urge to look back or rush ahead. It simply felt like standing in a wide place where balance came naturally. Daphne sensed it one quiet morning. The thought arrived gently. This is the middle, not of a story, but of a way of being, and the thought passed without ceremony. Halfway no longer meant incomplete. It meant grounded. At the library, she rearranged a display without labeling it as new. People noticed anyway. Some paused, some smiled, some moved on. The change didn't ask for attention, it allowed it. Daphne realized that progress had lost its old pressure. There was no race against time, no invisible scoreboard. The idea of later had softened into when. That evening she met Emery for tea. They sat longer than planned, then parted without counting the minutes. Neither felt the need to mark the moment. Walking home, Daphne felt a quiet steadiness. The sky above remained as it had been, open, silent, unchanged. It didn't feel distant. It felt companionable. Halfway was not a checkpoint. It was a place to stand, breathe, and continue from, without wait, without hurry, without needing to be anywhere else. Daphne unlocked her door and stepped inside, carrying nothing extra. The story did not turn here. It widened. Comfort arrived disguised as relief. The days following this widening were the calmest Daphne could remember. Meetings ended early. Small problems resolved themselves before turning sharp. Systems, social, personal, invisible, seemed to anticipate needs, smoothing friction from daily life. People smiled more. They slept better. They felt safe. And that was the danger. Daphne sensed it first as a subtle dulling, not exhaustion, not boredom, something quieter, an absence of questioning, a softness that asked nothing in return. At the library, routine solidified. The same chairs, the same hours, the same conversations looping gently back on themselves. It all worked, too well. Comfort, she realized, could become a ceiling if left unexamined. One afternoon she moved a chair that had sat in the same place for years, just a few centimeters. The room felt different immediately. People shifted. Someone noticed. Someone asked why. I wanted to see what would happen, Daphne said. That answer stayed with her. Later, she walked longer than usual, past familiar streets into ones she rarely visited. Nothing went wrong. Nothing remarkable happened. But her attention sharpened, the way it only did when she wasn't fully settled. The sky above remained quiet, unchanged. It offered no warning. Comfort never did. That night, Daphne wrote a single line in a notebook she rarely used. Ease is not the same as growth. She closed the book, not knowing when she would open it again. Comfort wasn't the enemy, but mistaking it for a rival was. And Daphne, standing gently in the middle of everything, chose to stay awake. After comfort revealed its limits, friction returned, not as conflict, but as texture. Daphne felt it in small resistances, a conversation that didn't resolve easily, a choice that required pause, a day that refused to flow exactly as expected. None of it felt threatening. It felt alive. At the library, a proposal sparked debate. Opinions diverged. Voices rose slightly, then steadied. People listened longer than they spoke. The disagreement didn't break the calm, it gave it shape. Daphne realized how necessary this gentle friction was. Without it, attention dulled. With it, awareness sharpened. That evening, she tried a new route home and got briefly lost. Not enough to worry. Enough to notice details she usually missed. A mural half hidden by vines. A bakery closing its shutters. A child counting steps aloud. Friction brought her back to the present. The sky above remained unchanged, but it no longer felt like a backdrop. It felt like context, wide enough to hold uncertainty without erasing it. Daphne understood then that ease and effort were not opposites. They were partners. Too much comfort lulled. Too much struggle exhausted. Between them lived something resilient. Gentle friction kept life awake. And Daphne, attentive again, welcomed it, not as disruption, but as proof that she was still moving. Awake did not mean alert in the old sense. It wasn't vigilance or tension. It was a softness that could still notice. Daphne felt it in how she listened now, not just to words, but to timing, to what arrived early, to what hesitated. to what never quite formed but still mattered. At the library, she paused more often between tasks, not from indecision, but to sense what came next. The day unfolded differently when she allowed that space, less efficient on paper, more precise in practice. People, too, seemed to be staying awake together. They questioned gently. They checked assumptions without accusation. Curiosity replaced certainty as the default posture. One afternoon, a visitor asked Daphne why things felt different lately, less rushed but more focused. Because we're paying attention again, she said, and surprised herself with how true it felt. That evening, Daphne noticed how fatigue arrived honestly now. When she was tired, she rested. When she was engaged, she stayed. There was no forcing either state. The sky above remained quiet, unchanged, vast. It no longer symbolized mystery or distance. It mirrored awareness. Staying awake did not require effort. It required permission to notice, to adjust, to remain present even when comfort tempted her to drift. Daphne closed her eyes before sleep, not to escape the day, but to let it settle fully. Awake, she had learned, was not the opposite of rest. It was the way rest stayed alive. There was an edge to awareness now, but it wasn't sharp. It didn't cut. It outlined. Daphne felt it when she recognized moments as they were happening, not afterward. A laugh that mattered. A silence that carried meaning. A decision forming before it needed words. This subtle edge didn't create distance. It created clarity. At the library, Daphne noticed how often people paused mid-action, sensing whether to continue or shift. Books were returned half-read without embarrassment. Conversations ended when their energy changed. Nothing was forced past its natural point. The day felt more honest that way. Daphne realized she was no longer afraid of missing something important. What mattered announced itself, not loudly but unmistakably. The rest could pass without consequence. That evening, she sat with Emery again, sharing tea in near silence. When they spoke, it was to name what was already present. "This feels balanced," Emery said. Daphne nodded. "It feels edged," she replied, "but gently." The sky above them remained unchanged, wide and quiet. It didn't demand interpretation. It simply held the frame. The subtle edge wasn't about guarding against loss. It was about recognizing shape. And in that recognition, Daphne felt steadier than ever, awake, rested, and quietly prepared for whatever came next. Some things were still hard. Daphne noticed that clearly now. But difficulty had changed its meaning. It was no longer something to avoid at all costs, nor something to endure for the sake of proving strength. Difficulty, when chosen consciously, felt different. It felt purposeful. Daphne felt it when she agreed to help with a project that would take time and patience. It wasn't urgent, it wasn't glamorous, but it mattered to the people involved. She said yes without hesitation and without resentment. Around her, others were making similar choices. Not the easiest path, not the most impressive one, the one that aligned. At the library, a discussion group formed around a topic that had no clear answers. Attendance was inconsistent. Progress was slow. Still it continued. People returned because the effort felt honest. Daphne realized that ease had not disappeared. It had learned when to step aside. That evening, she walked home feeling a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with accomplishment. The sky above remained open and silent, unchanged in its vastness. She didn't feel challenged by it. She felt accompanied. The chosen difficulty did not weigh her down. It strengthened her footing. And with that footing, Daphne knew she could continue. Not drifting, not straining, but moving with intention into whatever shape the days would take next. Commitment no longer arrived with grand declarations. It settled in quietly, revealed through repetition rather than promise. Daphne felt it in the way she showed up, not perfectly, not always with energy, but consistently, honestly, without the need to dramatize her presence. She noticed how this changed her relationship with time. Days were no longer hurdles to clear. They were threads, each one connected, each one asking only to be held long enough to matter. At the library, the project she had agreed to moved slowly. Some days nothing visible happened. Still, Daphne returned. Others did too. The commitment lived in that return, not in results. Around the city, similar patterns formed. People stayed with things longer, not out of obligation, but out of care. Leaving was still allowed, but staying had regained its dignity. That evening, Daphne wrote a short note to herself and placed it inside the same notebook she had used weeks ago. I'm here because I chose to be. She didn't reread it. She didn't underline it. The words didn't need reinforcement. Outside, the sky remained unchanged, wide and silent. It neither approved nor questioned her choice. That was its gift. Commitment, Daphne realized, didn't bind her. It grounded her. And grounded she continued, steady, awake, and quietly willing to meet what came next. Some agreements were never voiced. They lived beneath words, carried in action and attention. Daphne felt it one morning when she woke earlier than usual, not from urgency but readiness. The day didn't demand anything specific. Still, she felt a quiet yes inside her, already given. Yes to showing up. Yes to adjusting. Yes to staying present even when clarity lagged behind. At the library, she noticed how often people mirrored this unspoken yes. A volunteer stayed a little longer without being asked. A visitor helped reshelve books before leaving. Small gestures accumulated into something durable. The unspoken yes didn't exhaust anyone. It sustained them. Daphne realized that refusal had not disappeared. Boundaries were still drawn. But when yes appeared now, it was clean, free of guilt, free of performance. That evening she walked as the light softened, noticing how easily her body moved when her mind wasn't negotiating every step. The sky above remained quiet, unchanged, vast. She didn't look to it for permission. She already had it. The unspoken yes was not a promise about the future. It was a decision renewed moment by moment. And in that renewal, Daphne felt a calm strength, one that didn't push forward, but moved willingly, exactly as far as needed. Direction returned without pressure, not as a map or a destination, but as a subtle orientation, like knowing which way is forward even in low light. Daphne felt it while organizing materials late one afternoon. She didn't plan the order. Her hands moved, her attention followed, and the structure revealed itself as she went. When she finished, it felt right in a way that didn't need explanation. Around her, people were trusting this sense more often. They asked fewer, "What should I do?" questions and more, "What feels aligned right now?" The answers weren't always clear, but they were workable. At the library, a visitor asked for guidance on a project that felt overwhelming. Daphne listened, then suggested starting with the smallest piece that still mattered. Direction doesn't come first, she said. It shows up once you move. The visitor smiled, relieved. That evening, Daphne took a familiar route home and noticed new details. A plant thriving in a crack of concrete, a handwritten sign offering free lemons, a window lit warmly from inside. Direction didn't require novelty, it required attention. The sky above remained unchanged, open and quiet. It no longer felt like a guide or a judge. It was simply there, like a constant reference point. Daphne understood then that direction wasn't something she needed to search for. It emerged from choosing, again and again, to move with care. And that was enough to keep going. Trust no longer felt like a leap. It felt like a steady step onto ground that had already proven it could hold weight. Daphne noticed it in how she planned less and relied more on responsiveness. When something changed, she adjusted without suspicion. When someone surprised her, she listened instead of bracing. Trust had become practical. At the library, a new system was introduced with minimal instruction. People learned it together, making small mistakes, helping one another quietly. No one demanded guarantees. The process earned confidence as it unfolded. Daphne realized that trust wasn't blind anymore. It was informed by presence. That evening, she shared a simple meal with friends. Plans shifted mid-conversation. Someone arrived late. Someone left early. The gathering held its shape anyway, flexible and intact. Walking home, Daphne felt a lightness that wasn't excitement. It was ease, the kind that comes from not rehearsing disappointment. The sky above remained wide and unchanged. It didn't promise anything. And somehow that felt trustworthy too. Daphne understood then that trust wasn't about expecting things to go well. It was about knowing she could meet them if they didn't. With that knowledge, her steps stayed light, her attention open, her direction steady. Trust carried her forward, not quickly, not dramatically, but well. Being in the middle no longer felt like waiting. It felt like breathing. Daphne noticed it one quiet afternoon when nothing on her list demanded completion. She moved between tasks without urgency, letting pauses exist without filling them. The day expanded instead of slipping away. The middle had become livable. At the library, people lingered after finishing what they came for. No one rushed to replace one activity with another. Conversations unfolded, then rested. Presence didn't need justification. Daphne realized how often life had once been treated as a corridor, something to pass through on the way to elsewhere. Now the corridor had widened into a room, a place to stand, a place to notice. That evening she sat by the window as the light faded. The sky remained unchanged, vast and quiet, but it no longer felt distant from where she stood. It felt adjacent. The middle that breathes did not demand progress. It did not promise resolution. It offered continuity. Daphne closed the window, turned inward, and let the moment be complete on its own terms. Halfway was no longer a marker. It was a rhythm. And in that rhythm she continued, awake, unburdened, and fully here. It happened without warning. No sound. No alarm. No sudden fear. Daphne noticed it, because the sky changed its behavior. A point of light appeared where no aircraft should be. It did not blink. It did not move in a line. It hovered, precise, deliberate, unmistakably placed. Others saw it too. People stopped walking. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Phones were raised, then slowly lowered again as if recording suddenly felt insufficient. The light expanded, not brighter but wider. Its edges softened, bending the air around it. Time did not stop, but it thinned. No message came. No signal followed. Just presence. Stefan felt no urge to run, no instinct to explain. For the first time in months, the silence in the sky was no longer empty. It was occupied. The light withdrew as gently as it had arrived. No acceleration, no collapse. It simply folded back into the dark, leaving the sky exactly as it had been before. But nothing else returned to its previous state. People did not panic. They did not cheer. They did not chase meaning. They went home quietly. Daphne stood a while longer, her neck aching slightly from looking up. When she finally lowered her gaze, the city felt the same. Buildings, streets, windows, but the agreement had shifted. The question was no longer, "Are we alone?" It was, "Have we been seen?" That night, Daphne wrote nothing. She didn't need to. The world had not ended. The world had not begun again. Something had simply acknowledged it. And humanity, awake enough to notice, chose not to rush toward answers. The sky remained vast. The presence had passed. But the silence was no longer neutral. It was shared,